At the foot of the Cascade Mountains in Oregon, there was once a small town called Bloomfield, where time seemed to pass more slowly than elsewhere. Once upon a time, Bloomfield bloomed like an endless spring painting wildflowers, covering every dirt road, bees buzzing across the sky, and every morning was filled with the sweet scent of nature. But that was a story of the past. Now that wildflower town has fallen into slumber. The flower fields were replaced by prefabricated houses, parking lots, and convenience stores. The weather had become unpredictable: spring arriving late, summers scorching. Bees gradually disappeared year by year, and nearby beekeeping farms closed one after another, leaving behind empty wooden cabins and faded signs fluttering in the wind. At the edge of town stood the small home of David, a widowed carpenter who had lost his wife 7 years ago. He lived with his 14-year-old daughter, Emily. Every morning, he still rose on time, brewed a pot of weak coffee, and sat by the window, gazing out at the overgrown yard, once the flower garden his wife had loved the most. Emily often left early for school or helped at the bookstore after class. She was a kind and cheerful girl, but her eyes often followed her father with a quiet worry. David remained his usual silent self, always immersed in his own thoughts. Lately, his coughs had become more frequentary, short, but deepened. Though Emily asked, he would only smile and wave her off. Inside that home, time felt frozen, but one thing remained alive: the memories of blooming seasons, of mornings when bees danced around the porch, and the laughter of a beloved wife, now gone. And in the silence, something seemed to wait to be awakened, whether by a small hand or the return of a single bee. One overcast morning in May, as the last of the spring winds swept through the valley, David stepped out of the clinic with the results in late-stage lung cancer. The doctor had spoken gently, but each word hit his heart like a blow. He didn't cry, just nodded in gratitude and drove home in silence. Along the way, Emily's face kept flashing before him: her smile, the clumsy way she tied her hair in the morning, the light in her eyes when she talked about a new book. David knew he didn't have much time left. And he also knew it was time to leave something behind for Emily: not money, not hollow last words, but a piece of memory, a thread of connection that he once received from his own father. The bees, the flower fields, and a love for real, living things. That afternoon, he knocked on Emily's door. "Do you want to go somewhere with Dad?" he asked, his voice as gentle as a breeze. Emily looked up, surprised. It had been a long time since her father last asked her that. They drove toward the edge of the forest, down an old dirt road Emily barely remembered from childhood day trips. After nearly an hour, they stopped in front of a weathered wooden gate where the sign "Hathaway Apiary" still dangled in the wind. Emily's eyes widened as she looked around. The path was overgrown, the old hives covered in dust, but something warm and familiar crept into every breath she took. "This is where your grandfather taught me to keep bees," David said softly, eyes fixed on the past. "And I think it's time you knew, too." Emily had never seen her father like this, gentle but resolute, sad but not broken. She nodded and followed him into the old apiary. Her fingers brushed lightly across the surface of an old hive box, feeling the coolness of the wood and the dust of years gone by. "You know," David said, his voice slightly raspy, "bees are small creatures, but they carry the weight of life itself. Without them, the world would be different, colder, quieter." Emily clenched her fists gently. Inside her, something stirred: curiosity, emotion, and a vague sense of fear. But more than anything, she felt it clearly. Her father was passing on something sacred, something deeper than words. A new journey had begun, not just about bees, but about memory, love, and the things that time could never steal away. Every afternoon, As the sun tilted through the trees at the edge of the property, David and Emily stood together in the fields where once the hum of bees and the scent of honey used to fill the air. The wind still blew, but the bees hadn't returned. Even so, it didn't stop the father and daughter from beginning their little lessons amidst the sleeping wilderness. David taught her the simplest but most delicate things: how to read the color of a flower's petals to know which ones held the most pollen, how to gently place her hand on the hive lid to feel the movement inside without startling the bees. Bees are sensitive, he said. They can sense the worry in your hands. Emily listened closely. At first, she was unsure, but after just a few days, she had learned to put on the mesh veil to steady her breathing when opening a hive. Her favorite part was sitting beside her dad, holding a small smoker, watching him carefully pry open the honeycomb frames and pour golden honey into glass jars. "It's like bottling summer sunlight," she exclaimed once, and her father beamed with joy. But what struck Emily the most was when David described the hive as a living society. "You know," he said, "worker bees don't live long, but in their short lives, they do everything. Clean the hive, feed the larvae, collect nectar, guard the colony, and when the queen grows weak, the hive begins preparing to raise a new one-knot out of betrayal. But because life must continue," Emily quietly wrote in her notebook, "silent sacrifice is also a form of love." The old leather-bound journal her father had given her with worn corners and a handwritten message on the first page that read, "For Emily, the last hive he showed me had become her little treasure." Inside were notes, drawings of bees, and daily thoughts and feelings she carefully collected. David wasn't just teaching Emily about bees. He was teaching her how to love nature without needing a reason, how to remember the most beautiful things not with pictures, but through lived moments, how to face the unchangeable with every ounce of gentleness one could offer. And Emily, in the silence, began to understand. Sometimes the most precious thing a parent can leave behind is an old flower field, a weathered hive, and a heart that knows how to listen to the quiet call of little things. That spring arrived late, but it bloomed in the strangest and gentlest way. The field behind the apiary, which for years had been only dry grass and cracked soil, suddenly came alive with clusters of lavender, dandelions, and wild daisies. Shades of purple, yellow, and white danced together, fragile yet radiant. Emily stood still in the middle of the field, notebook in hand. She turned to look at her father. David just smiled, a faint, warm smile, as if nature was finally responding to all that he had once given. The bees started to return. At first, just a few, then more, small groups finding their way back, buzzing around the fresh blossoms. Emily grew more skilled with every passing day, recording the best times to harvest honey, identifying pollen types, placing extra flower pots near the hives when the colony grew. She even began to recognize subtle shifts in the bees' buzzing when they were warning of something, when they had found sweet flowers, and the soft flapping when the hive returned home at dusk. David was growing weaker. Each day, he could only sit outside for a short while, but he always made the effort. He'd settle into the wooden chair beneath the shade tree, hands clasped around a cup of herbal tea, eyes following Emily's every move with quiet pride. It was as though he was trying to etch into his memory the image of his little girl now, standing strong beside the hive, resilient like the very creatures he had always cherished. One moonlit night, with the wind gently brushing through the blooming field, David called Emily outside. The two of them lay together on the grass, gazing up at a sky scattered with stars. For a long time, neither said a word, just the night and the soft buzz of bees drifting in the distance. Then he spoke softly, his voice low and broken. "If one day I'm no longer here, just listen. If you can still hear the bees, it means life still exists. And if life remains, then you are never alone." Emily held his hand, her eyes stinging. In that moment, she didn't need promises or forever, just the sound of bees, the flower field, and her father beside her. That final blooming season for Divide was not an end. It was a continuation, passed on in every petal and every wing, into the heart of a 14-year-old girl who now understood some things, when kept with love, will live on forever. On an early autumn morning, a crisp chill slipped through the window frame like a sign Emily never expected. The apiary stood quietly in its place, the flower field behind it still shimmering in the soft sunlight, and the breeze carried the sweet scent of lavender. But in the small room where her father had rested the night before, everything had come to a silent halt. David, the father, the teacher, the only friend, had passed away as gently as he had lived. No cries of pain, no final words. Emily discovered it when she came in, like every other morning, to call him out to the bee yard. His hand still rested on his chest, loosely holding the environmental journal, his face peaceful, as if dreaming of past flower seasons. But his eyes, the ones that always looked at her with warmth and quiet strength, would never open again. Emily collapsed beside the bed, not crying aloud. She only gripped the hand that had begun to grow cold, her heart overflowing with feelings she didn't know how to name: pain, emptiness, anger at the clear blue sky outside. Why was the world still beautiful when the one person who loved her most was gone? She walked out to the bee yard, her legs heavy as stone, everything blurred through her tears. When she reached hive number 3, the one least visited by bees, she saw a small envelope, carefully placed in a hollow corner of the wooden box. It was her father's handwriting, shaky but heartbreakingly familiar. Inside was a small map, marked with places he had once taken her to, and a short, handwritten note. "My dear, keep the bees. And if you can teach others to listen to them, love, Dad." Emily held the piece of paper tightly, collapsing to the ground in the early morning light, her tears soaking into the envelope. She cried as if her soul had been torn in half. She didn't know how to live without her father, didn't know what the future would look like. But when she heard the soft hum around her shoulder, when she saw a bee pause gently on her hand, she remembered his words. If you can still hear the bees, it means life still exists. From that day forward, Emily didn't just care for the bees. She cared for memory. She nurtured her father's dream. She was no longer a 14-year-old girl. She was the bearer of a mission, the voice of tiny creatures that desperately needed to be heard, the keeper of a love sown in tears, memories, and a promise. Under the early summer sun, Emily, the same girl who once sat sobbing beside her father's envelopano, stood tall in the apiary, holding a pot of bright purple salvia. Her hair was tied back neatly, sleeves rolled up, and her eyes no longer carried the haunted sorrow they once did. She had grown, not just in age, but in spirit. After David's death, Emily spent many silent months. But every morning, when the hum of bees echoed near her ear, she recalled her father's steady gaze and his final promise. She began to study more, reading about ecosystems, joining online forums on bees and the environment. She discovered the wonders her father had tried to sow in her during those early evenings among the wildflowers, that bees were not just pollinators, but the essential bridge between flowers and fruit, earth and sky, nature and humanity. Emily decided to reopen the doors of the old apiary, not just to raise bees, but to teach others how to listen to them. She began with the town's children. A few schoolmates, a couple of neighborhood kids at first hesitant when they saw bees flying. But Emily patiently taught them how to stand still so the bees wouldn't feel threatened, how to identify wildflowers by season, how a flower emits a static charge that bees can read as a message, even though humans can't hear it. Every lesson was a small journey not through textbooks, but through sensation. Emily shared her father's story, their journey with the bees, the days when he was still strong. The children listened quietly, sometimes moved, sometimes cheering, when they saw a bee crawl into the bamboo tube they had hung up just the day before. She started a blog to keep everything alive. Its title held the dearest memory, the last hive he showed me. She wrote with all her heart about beekeeping techniques, the environment, grief, and the belief that renewal could begin with the tiniest of things. Within weeks, the blog spread. People from other states messaged her to say thank you, sending pictures of new gardens planted with flowers for bees and handmade hives tucked behind their kitchens. But the most miraculous change of all, the very adults who once dismissed the apiary as a relic of the past, now brought flowers to plant by the fence. An elderly widow whose husband had died of lung disease placed a lavender pot at the entrance. A local carpenter brought a wooden sign engraved with the words, "If you can hear the bees, it means life is still calling you." Emily saw all of this and smiled, not as a girl who had lost her father, but as a keeper of a legacy far greater than any condolence, the belief that nature will always respond if we dare to begin with love. One April morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the thin veil of mist, Emily opened the beehive shed as she always did. The familiar buzzing filled the air. But today, something was different, very different. Before her eyes was a scene that made her heart tighten. Hundreds of bees were swirling around the wildflower field behind the apiary 3 times, even 5 times more than in any previous season. Clusters of lavender, dandelions, and wild daisies bloomed brilliantly, as if they had never been forgotten. The hum of bees merged into a vibrant symphony of spring, not from a speaker, not from memory, but truly reborn. Just days before, an article in the Oregon Daily Voice had drawn wide attention. A 14-year-old girl revives the bees and her father's dream. The article recounted Emily's journey, from the girl who once sat alone before an empty hive, to the young woman who opened her apiary's doors to the entire community. The photo attached showed Emily journaling next to a tray of honey, her gentle gaze fixed on the bees as if she were listening to a wordless story. That very week, Emily received an invitation to speak at the high school near town. For the first time, she stood on stage, holding the old notebook her father had given her, her voice trembling slightly. "My dad once told me, if you can still hear the bees, it means life still exists. Today, I hear it clearer than ever." No one left during her speech. Local media continued to cover the story. One young reporter who had once been in Emily's class captioned a photo with the words, "She didn't save the bees alone, she taught us how." The town officials who had once viewed the apiary as a private legacy proposed supporting its expansion into an official ecological learning space with a new name: Emily Hive, Ecological Learning Center. Emily declined the commemorative payment, asking only, "Please keep everything simple so the bees will still want to come back." And the bees did come back. There were so many bees that for the first time, townspeople could see their flight paths forming distinct streams through the trees-like living trails of light across the sky. Children gathered, clutching cameras, squealing with joy when a bee landed on someone's hat. An elderly man whispered, "In my whole life, I've never heard the bees sound so beautiful again." Emily stood by the apiary fence, her hand gently touching a new hive. Inside her, her father's old words echoed once more. "You can't hold on to spring, but you can plant the seeds so it will return. And today, spring had truly returned, not just in the blossoms, but in every heart moved by something so small, the sound of bees. That afternoon, the world seemed to hold its breath. The golden light of dusk fell softly across clusters of wild purple flowers, swaying quietly in the breeze. Emily stood alone in the apiary, once just a dream, once filled with her father's laughter, and now filled with the symphony of bees and spring. She opened the old notebook, its corners worn, its pages marked by time, and flipped back to the very first page. Her father's handwriting was still clear, warm like his voice during every lesson in the wildflower fields. The last hive he showed me was not made of wax. It was made of memory, love, and purpose. Emily smiled gently. No tears fell, but her heart ached in a quiet, tender way, as if love and memory had reached the very core of her being. The apiary was no longer just an old place at the edge of a sleepy town. It had become a gathering ground for hope, where bees buzzed freely, children took notes, adults planted new flowers, and nature seemed to be finding its voice again. She held a small wooden plaque, carved by hand from an old tree in their backyard, and etched it with a simple line. She hung it on the gate beneath the new Emily Hive sign, gifted by the town. To save the bees is to remember the people who taught us how to care. Shah. A gentle breeze swept by, brushing against the wooden sign like a silent nod from nature itself. In that moment, Emily felt her father was still somewhere nearby, not as a memory that had ended, but as a message still being carried by the bees, flying across fields now blooming once again. From that last hive he left behind, Emily understood. The mission wasn't just to save the bees, but to preserve the very things that make us human: care, attentiveness, and unconditional love for the world around us. And so, the 14-year-old girl she once was had become the keeper of a final promise, and the one who would begin a new future for flowers, for bees, and for everyone who still believes that something small can change the world. When we look at the tiny wings of a bee, it's easy to assume its role in the world is insignificant. But the truth is, if bees were to disappear, entire ecosystems would collapse. Bees are not just creatures that make honey, they are the silent heart of nature. More than 75% of all crops grown around the world, from vegetables, fruits, to flowering plants, depend on bee pollination. Without bees, there are no flowers. Without flowers, no fruit. And from there, the entire food chain begins to fall apart. But bees don't just bring life to our crops, they carry a message that every form of life, no matter how small, holds an irreplaceable purpose. Emily's story is not a fairy tale. It is a reality unfolding where everyday people choose to rise, choose to replant a flower, rebuild a hive, and listen closely to the whispers of nature. From a small garden, from a balcony, from a quiet child keeping a bee journal, can witness the future being planted. We don't need to be scientists or large-scale activists to create change. We only need to begin with a single flower pot, a clean bowl of water for the bees, or something as simple as sharing a message. If you believe that nature still deserves to be protected, like this video to support the quiet journeys bringing life back to the world. Share to spread the message. Saving the bees is saving ourselves. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss these powerful stories of humanity, nature, and hope. Turn on notifications to keep walking this path with us, telling stories of dreams blooming from the smallest acts. Mullah. Because sometimes, to save an entire planet, all it takes is saving one hive.